Is Gerald's game good? We're going to find out on this episode of the Mostly Existential Podcast.
Super generic bass and as an intro.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Mostly Existential Podcast. My name is Justin.
And I'm an octopus in a jar. No, I'm Kenneth. I wish.
I was like, yo, this octopus has some good dialect going on. A little above its grade.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if we had an octopus in the jar, it would probably get out of that jar.
Well, yeah, because it's an octopus. Yeah. And then it would be more than welcome to join us on the podcast.
What if octos, when they get comfortable with other organisms or humans could just communicate with them telepathically? That'd be nuts. On an instinctual level. Not it's giving me speech, but it's I know what that octopus wants right now because it's food.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or you could just feel whatever it's feeling. That'd be kind of crazy.
Yeah. Anyway.
Sorry.
Tangent aside, this podcast is about it's going over music and film review. Today we're going to be checking out Gerald's Game. It's a Netflix original film, and when I say Netflix original, I don't mean in the way that most of their TV shows are, where they just purchase the rights after the fact.
Yeah.
Shows such as Arrested Development, American Crime Story.
Yeah, but Netflix has really been putting it on lately.
Yeah, I predict that Netflix will eventually be mostly original content.
I agree. At some point, yeah.
Because they're already moving towards that, and you can see that. I think they have this planned out, already mapped out of how they're going to transition.
Yeah.
But regardless, so this is an actual, Netflix had a hand in producing it. I'm sure they just financed it more or less. So this film comes to us from director Mike Flanagan, who's not some huge name actor. He's mostly worked on as a director and writer on pretty much mostly paranormal horror thrillers. But he's actually had a long time goal of adapting this book, which this is a Stephen King book of the same name, Gerald's Game. Hey, that's not lame. Dope MC on the track, you know what I'm saying. I
love it. I love the energy in here today. It's good.
So Mike Flanagan, director, and then screenplay by both Mike Flanagan and Jeff Howard, who has also worked with Flanagan in the past. Probably don't really know much of their films, but they did a film called Ouija. Yeah, which I never saw. I vaguely remember seeing that come out. They have some others that I think I've heard of a little bit, but nothing.
Ouija's the one about the Ouija board, correct?
Yeah.
I'm a detective.
So without further also this stars I'm gonna totally mess up some names here, but to go over our main cast, we have Carla Gugino as Jessie, which is the female lead.
Yep.
Carla is the mom from Spy Kids.
Oh yeah.
Yep. So stars the mom from Spy Kids, back with her most dangerous mission yet.
Herself.
Then we have Bruce Greenwood as Gerald. We have Henry Thomas as Tom, Jesse's gross father.
Very.
Yeah, so just to let you know, this is going to be a spoilery review. Because, it's hard to really get into the film without
spoiling it.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to talk for that long about it if we didn't get into spoilers. Then we have Chiara Aurelia. You sound like an elf. as young Jessie. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this film. I showed you this film. I had already seen it once before I presented it to you. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, because I have a feeling they're mostly similar to mine, but perhaps different in some areas.
I wouldn't say hate, because that's way too extreme.
You didn't like it?
No. Okay. I feel like you know what's really interesting before I get into it? I think it's really funny that even when you and I don't particularly like things, we don't go as far as to call it bad. We can just say that I don't like it. But anyway, so at first I didn't know what to expect because I've never heard of it. So it was just like, okay.
I was also in that same vein when I first watched it. I had really no idea what I was getting in for.
So then when the beginning starts and it's like, oh, okay. Because all I knew that it was like a horror film, which I feel is a weird labeling for this film.
When call it more of a thriller.
A thriller, yeah. Because not anything like inherently horror happens. It's just, you know, like a kind of psychological thriller is the way that I would, you know, hit that. But so we're starting off and we have these two characters and they're obviously just going, you know, somewhere away. Turns out that they're, you know, staying at this cabin to, you know, just kind of spice up their marriage and get away,
you know, try and rekindle and
something.
Yeah.
And that was all fine and dandy, and then, you know, the dog is introduced.
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay, where's this going? And then the handcuffs happen, and then I wanted to text you in all caps, why am I watching this movie, Davis? And then my man's had the heart attack, and I was like, okay, wait, we're in it. And so the movie actually kind of does take a very interesting approach to this, because I thought because it was a horror film, I was prepared for way more disgusting outcomes than the ones that we got. I didn't expect it to be this whole psychological sort of thing of her losing her mind and, you know, representations of her husband and herself talking her through this whole experience, which I actually thought was really cool. Just that sort of aspect of like, you have the husband who's kind of like, oh, you're wasting time. You're doing this, you're doing that, whatever. And then herself will be like, okay, no, calm down. We got to get to work. So remember dialogue sequences. Remember, you know, like I remember when she got the cup of water, right?
Yeah.
And there was that whole moment of she wanted to drink it, but she couldn't. So the representation of herself was like, no, you got to put it back because you can't do anything about it. But if you spill it, then so put it back. But then it's like, oh yeah, that's right. You bought this slip news, so the tag is up there. So fashion the tag into a straw, drink it. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is actually kind of nifty, just going through this. And I thought the actors did a very good job.
Just in case you're watching or not watching, in case you're listening to this review, not having seen the film, just to give a synopsis of what we're talking about here. Basically, you're introduced to the two main characters. You see that one of the husband like packs handcuffs in the suitcase, and they're going on this trip up to this like lake house that they have. And you learn that's kind of like to rekindle this dying spark of their marriage. And the way they're doing that is, you know, exploring, you know, new sexual boundaries between each other. So that's where the handcuffs come in. She's kind of uncomfortable with the situation. And in the midst of it, when she's like, yo, I don't want to do this, Gerald...
after being creepy.
After being creepy, he has a heart attack. And basically dies, and so she's left there with these not like fake handcuffs one would typically use in a situation like this, like real handcuffs. She is hooked to the bedpost, and no one's around for miles, and she has to basically figure out what's going on. She more or less loses her mind, as they put it, and she sees these hallucinations of her and her husband, who of course represent various parts of her, as you were saying. And that's how you get the character's inner dialogue, is through these representations of these characters. So it's, if anything, it's definitely an interesting way to adapt to a film medium what is mostly internal dialogue. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess starting from the beginning, and I was going to say that I hate this movie, but I was, you know, this of me, I was being like facetious, but to other people who don't know, I was, you know. Anyway, so just as a side note, Gerald's a really bad dom. Horrible. Okay. The moment she was like, hey, crying her eyes out, let me out of this. Okay.
Well, my thing is
joking.
So I almost thought at near the beginning of the film that this movie was just going to be one giant kink shame. Because here's my thing is if you're going to do things like that, you would communicate with your partner beforehand, and there was clearly no communication.
Or even if you didn't because you wanted to surprise somebody, that's fine. But if you were really about like doing this, the moment that they stopped consenting to the situation, you gotta take off the handcuffs.
Well, my thing is too is like she clearly didn't know. Not only was she surprised, but like it was more or less established that they've never done something like this before,
right?
So I don't really think that he communicated really much of anything.
True. But it was kind of weird because then the dialogue sequence that with the live Gerald made me feel a certain kind of way, because it was just like, it just made you feel uncomfortable because here she was in this tied up, obviously like in this position where she can't do anything, and wanting to just get out of this situation, and she can't. And the person that's her husband is just being weird, and you're just like, and I honestly was so, I'm not even gonna lie to you, I was mentally preparing myself for a point of this movie to go that far because of the situation, whether it be her or something else. I was just like, I hope it doesn't go there.
Yeah, I probably would not have brought the film forth if that was the case.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, because when I was watching it, I was like, please don't. Like, come on. Like, I really don't want to, you know, watch that in a film, or, you know, but it didn't. So it was cool, but it was just like, I mean, I guess they kind of alluded to it, and they made it known that this is the position that she's in, so things can happen.
Yeah.
But they didn't take it that far, which I did very much enjoy. I think they did a really, really good job at establishing that this was in her head. When she started talking to Gerald, when he came up on the bed and he has the wound from when the dog, like, so let me establish this dog character real fast. While they're driving up there, they come across a stray dog who's eating some roadkill, and they get it out of the road. She then later cuts up some meat and tries to, you know, feed the dog.
Yeah.
Which eventually does happen. They have a dialogue on it, but the dog is able to get back into the house later because they left a door open.
Right. And so basically what happens is Gerald is lying on the floor. The stray dog, being a stray dog, comes in and actually starts eating Gerald, which
makes sense.
It makes sense. It's horrifying.
Yeah.
But this is actually at the point where our main character Jessie begins to lose her mind because she just
can't handle that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the dog was like licking him, and I was like, yep, he's testing. Because, I mean, that's what dogs do, is they, if they think something's dead, they'll lick it and test it. And then started drinking the blood, and then he just went right in for the arm. And I was like, yeah, that's, what dogs do.
So,
especially stray ones.
You said that you really enjoyed how they made it known to the audience that this was all in her head.
They did it before it was even outrightly said. Before he was like, oh, you're losing your mind. It was the moment where she's looking at him talk.
Yeah.
But then looks at the ground and sees that Gerald's hands are still there from when he originally fell.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, this is in her head. Mm-hmm. Right? Because I was just like, because at first I was like, how was that dog like bite not the thing that woke you up, but like seconds afterwards?
Yeah.
But so I think they did a really good job at establishing that, of just before it's outrightly said, here's Gerald talking to Jess, and then you're like, oh, that's weird. But then Jess looks down, there his arms. He's still dead. She's losing her mind. She's hallucinating these things. And I was like, that was a very tasteful way to do that. And then they say, and then he's like, oh, well, you're losing your mind.
Yeah.
Da 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 da. But that just kind of subtle camera, whatever.
Right. I'll get into it a little bit more, but one of the things I do like about this film is its use of visual storytelling. I think it's very adept at that. But I'm going to get into my thing after you go through the film, because I am very curious about your overall opinions. So you enjoyed the way they represented that.
Yes.
What were the things that made you really dislike the film, or the saving graces of the film also?
Towards the end of it, I wouldn't even say it's pacing, because this movie does kind of have a very nice pace all the way through, I would say. I just felt that towards the end of it overstayed its welcome.
I could see that. In
the sense of, okay, she got through, this whole ordeal, and got, she cut her wrists.
Get out of
one handcuff.
I will say that was so gruesome.
Yeah, that was rough to watch.
I literally couldn't look at the screen for parts of it, because she had that gross skin flap, and it was just like it wasn't until she wrapped it up that I was like comfortable enough to be like, okay, I can do this film again.
Yeah, my thing was, I'm like, did you really have to cut at that particular part of her hand? But her and herself did say you need a lot of blood to get out, but it was to act as lubricant. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I gathered that, but I'm like, how much blood did you actually need for that? Because I'm like, but I do think that it's really cool that she passed out as a result of it, because that's what any human being would do. And so even though, because that was a whole thing of the plot of like, you got to get out before, what's his face comes back to creep and stuff like that. And it's like, she got out in time, but because of the blood loss and because of fatigue and dehydration and all that stuff, she passed out. Yeah. Woke up at nighttime, had to get out of the house, get in a car accident. And I felt that was all fine and dandy, but then you still have X amount of minutes after that trying to figure out what's happening, and she's writing that letter, and she's kind of recapping everything, which is fine, but it takes so long to finally finish the movie after that. Yeah, it has this point where, of course, you hit your dramatic conclusion, you hit that. And of course, you're going to need the come down factor after that. And I will agree that lasts pretty long, to the point where I don't feel like I'm connecting or feeling the same gratification that the character does. Yes. And instead, I'm just kind of looking at my watch
You know, just like, is this gonna end? Or,
you know, and you know, she's having her personal revelations, but she's still like seeing the eclipse or whatever, that representation of dark times in her life, the eclipse, and she still is having that issue. Come to find out that the dude that was creeping in the house wasn't a manifestation, but an actual person. And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And why? Like,
yeah, well, here's the thing is this is actually the original ending of the book as well. And the ending of the book is extremely divisive, and people oftentimes consider this one of Stephen King's lesser works anyway. Not to say it's bad, just not as good as a lot of his other stuff. And one of the big reasons is because a lot of people dislike the ending. And this film, because he loves the book so much, it makes sense that he would continue on with that ending, because he actually likes the ending. But it's not surprising that it's still very divisive.
yeah, I can clearly see why, because for me, somebody on the outside, it just, you know, because it kind of gave you this air of, because I think that believing that that was like maybe a personification of death or some sort of ghostly outside, because they established that, because, you know, when at a moment where Gerald was talking to her, of course, not a live Gerald, but dead Gerald, and it's established, was you never know what happened. You're one person alone in the dark, and you're a female, and you're more susceptible to these things than other. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what kind of spirits or whatever. Why did the dog leave? The dog left because it felt some sort of outer-worldly presence, maybe.
Also, there was the footprint as well.
Yes. And so it was just like that, believing that was some sort of otherworldly thing. I mean, it's presence anyway, but it's like it gave that character a sense of agency, and sort of just, oh, you're dealing with some sort of, you know, whether you think of it as like the manifestation of death or something like that. And it made sense for him to appear in the way that he did.
Yeah.
And it gave that character that agency. But then when you find out that it's an actual like person, it kind of just felt weird. It was just like, yeah, it still gave that agency in the plot, but it feels like a weird way to end it.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, by the way, I'm still dealing with stuff. I guess there's something I haven't dealt with yet. Oh, and then I come across this by happenstance. It turns out that this was a real person. It's like, why?
Yeah. The ending was one of the things that made me used about my emotions on the film. So I guess I'll get into my thoughts here. I think this film is technically extraordinarily proficient and adept at what it's doing.
Yes.
As I mentioned briefly, I think the visual storytelling is wonderfully done. I think the cinematography is really amazing. The way they've captured performances and using show don't tell methods really lends a good hand to this film. And I have probably my favorite example of how they use visual storytelling, and that's the very beginning of the film. So we open on a shot with like just blissful music with like a top-down view, faces obstructed because of the angle, and we have like a California king bed, which, by the way, the shot very well framed, very traditionally framed, and we can tell even just from this small view that they're pretty well off financially. You can tell just from what you can see of the room, and the fact that it's a California king bed.
Yeah.
And first we have Jesse packing, then it fades to Gerald packing later in the day, and it closes on the zoom in as he places the final items in his bag, which is the handcuffs that will, of course, come into play later. And then it fades to these hitting the microphone over here. And then it fades to these leading shots of the car, which you're like, okay, cool, they're going on their trip, whatever. And then what I find interesting is then we move from this outsider perspective straight into the intimacy of their relationship as we go from that leading shot, hard cut into the car.
Yeah.
And we're given now the faces of our characters introduction. And one thing that was subtle, and I don't think is always effective, but I think in this instance really just punctuated this outside perspective into their relationship, was how the music went from being overlaid to moving itself into the scene being played out of their car radio.
Yeah.
And to me, that wasn't just like a stupid gimmick. That just furthered the intimacy that we're now going to experience with our characters. And so this car scene, as well as the subsequent expository shots of the house that they arrive at, to me, details perfectly the relationship of Gerald and Jesse. In the car, we see Gerald make a very forward sexual advance while driving, which, cool, fine, whatever. And it's just kind of casually thwarted.
Yeah.
And, he starts to, put his hand on her thigh and stuff, and she just kind of, grabs it lovingly, and, kisses it. I don't know what you're doing.
Right, yeah.
So that already gives you, an idea of how they feel about this experience that they're going to have. Then perhaps the most blatant example of the dichotomy of them as people is when that stray dog appears. So they come to the sudden stop, feet from the dog. And Jesse expresses sorrow for the dog, and Gerald simply just honks his horn continuously until the dog moves out of the way. Jesse continues to vocalize her concern as they carry on, and Gerald simply just combats with an unempathetic and pragmatic, arguably selfish annoyance, saying that the dog will end up as roadkill himself if if
he keeps going after roadkill. Yeah,
exactly. So this small incident, I feel grants the viewer incredibly great insight into the highly differing concerns and worldviews of our two characters, and you don't have to be told that their marriage is troubled.
Yeah. It's very, very obvious. They don't have to say it.
Exactly. It's using feeling. Show, don't tell.
And the dialogue sequences between them, which I think they did a very good job as actors between the both of them.
Yeah, they definitely have a less is more with the dialogue, and I think it works really well because they're not sitting there expositing information they both know.
Right.
They're not sitting there just oh, you're such a good lawyer, Gerald. Just when characters talk about things that they both know, that's when people get disconnected. They never do that. Just little lines of dialogue this is supposed to be good for us. Things where there's a lot implied, but because they're using visual storytelling well, you understand what's going on. And to me, my personal interpretation, this isn't something that I necessarily think was the most purposeful thing, but examining that same scene further, specifically in regards to when Jesse notices the dog on the road, Gerald is shown as being distracted. He's either looking at his phone or looking at the GPS, whatever, and she tries to get his attention, and she fails the first time. And the second time, she says it again, and they stop within feet of the dog because he finally pays attention. I find it interesting that how quiet she is. She's just Gerald. And then even as they're closing in and the danger is becoming more imminent to hit this dog, she doesn't get that much louder. She's just kind of Gerald. It's barely louder. And that, to me, again, this is my own interpretation, but I feel it suggests her submissive role in the relationship and how she doesn't really have an ability to speak up in the relationship. Again, that's my personal interpretation, but I think it adds to how the relationship functions, and to me is a little important to understanding the dynamics of it and why her feelings are so mixed. And
I mean, I guess it especially comes into play later, showing that she doesn't really have a voice in things, because when she was like, get me out of the handcuffs, his first thing was, what if I won't?
Yeah.
And it's like, no.
Also, there's her remembering through her hallucination of Gerald, them being at parties, and if Gerald was just going off saying like really misogynistic things, whatever, she would just never say anything about it.
Yeah.
She didn't really have a voice in that relationship. And I think that subtle Gerald, like just no real intensity to her voice, I think that is definitely in line with what's going on. So all of these elements add up to what I feel like should be a very captivating film, because it does use visuals in such an effective way. It uses show don't tell methods, and also does something that I believe is like a Alfred Hitchcock thing that he's talked about. It's not really something that he's necessarily been like out. I think there are recordings of him saying this, but anyway, he's basically said like use only one coincidence, because what happens is then everything feels like plot armor if you're just using a bunch of coincidences, and you feel so disconnected. He had a mindset of use one coincidence and then make the rest be characters being characters. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this film definitely does that. The coincidence being Gerald has a heart attack. Everything else is character action.
Yeah.
Nothing else is necessarily coincidence, or at least not a major coincidence anyway.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Because you said, and I'm not directly quoting you, but you said all things seem to make up for a captivating film, but you said it in a way, were you not captivated by this film?
I was not. And the only real reason I can find for it is, despite its, I don't know, maybe it's within its technical proficiency and its ability to visually foreshadow, the film almost becomes too transparent to the point of predictability. And this hypothesis, I think, is furthered by the fact that I've seen the film with separate groups of people.
Yeah.
As well as just on my own. When I first saw it, the person I was watching it with, we both were kind of like calling things before they happened. When I saw it with a different group of friends, I was silent on purpose, because I didn't want to, give anything away. If I'm watching a film with someone and they've seen it, I don't want them to say anything about it. So I employed that as well. I was silent, but they were calling out the same things, because it becomes incredibly obvious.
Exactly. And I think, I wanted to touch on that later. It's, even though, it does do a lot of things well, there are various moments where the viewer is smarter than the people in the situation. And so you're just kind of waiting for things to happen. Yeah. As a viewer, and not getting, surprised by them, or not, being there for their revelation.
It's one of those things that, like, sometimes, even though I know that it's good that they're using visuals to foreshadow instead of being like talking about it, and then it comes, like, the way that they use more minimalistic dialogue and trying to not exposit through the dialogue is a good thing. And again, it comes back to, it's technically quite proficient in the way it does these things, but it just almost seems like visually they're like, hey, look at this thing, it'll be important later. You know what I mean?
You know what? I totally get that, because I remember in the beginning of the film where like the dog comes back for the beef, but they leave the door open and she like looks at it, and then there's a camera shot of the door just being wide open. I'm like, well, obviously the dog's gonna come back in the house, or something's gonna get in the house because the door is open. Like,
right. And
like it would have been more advantageous if, you know, the dog had come in and then wait, how did the dog get inside? And then maybe Gerald or herself would have been like, oh yeah, remember you left the door open. It's like, oh, okay, so you're finding these things out, but the way things are certainly laid out to the viewer is, like I said, the viewer being smarter than the characters in the situation. You're knowing these things. And I do think that there is something to the show don't tell. I completely agree, but when you're showing us certain things, like you said, of like, hey, this is going to be important later, it's like,
yeah, I think sometimes it's just a little too punctuated, because here's my thing is, I think it's effective and often good to have the events play out like they did, and not like an after the fact, oh yeah, you left the door open, because what it is it can, in a correct usage, feel far more exhilarating to a viewer when they didn't think of that, but they were shown it before.
Yeah.
When they had the not the tools, like the pieces to the puzzle, and then the movie connects those pieces later, that becomes really intriguing, because it's like, oh, here's this thing that's not important, and then it like comes up later and you're like, oh dang, that was important. Yeah. And so there's this very gratifying sense about that. The only problem is it's hard as a viewer of this film to not connect those dots way before the movie gets to it. And it becomes just a little frustrating, because it's just like, okay, yeah, I understand what's gonna go on at this point. And sometimes I feel like they do it really well, and they have key details and a very solid, well-rounded scenario. Like, for instance, as a viewer, you're never really like, why doesn't she just like call for help? Because they establish in a really clever way that definitely no one's going to hear her, because Gerald, with the window open, was basically just like, oh, call for help, like as part of the fantasy. Yeah. Confident that no one would hear it. So that tells you as a viewer that she can't just do that. Yeah. Because if that wasn't done, then you'd be sitting there just like, why don't you just try this? You know what I mean? So it establishes that no one's around for miles. Cool, fine, whatever. And so they do that in really effective ways, but with the whole dog thing, like, it's so just obvious from the get-go. Basically the entire sequence with her father and her memory was... Yeah. Like, literally... I called before the flashback, before we were getting to any of that she was abused by her father. It was painfully obvious to me. It just really made a lot of sense. And again, it was just one of those things where I was connecting the dots before the movie wanted me to. And so a lot of these moments fell flat. And so while, again, it was technically proficient in a lot of ways, it just didn't captivate, because it just lended itself being too predictable and therefore not nearly as engaging as I would like.
Also, I thought it was very weird. So I didn't necessarily think about the abuse of her father ahead until there was that dialogue sequence where Gerald called her mouse, and she was like, don't call me that. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and at that point I was
like,
just like,
you know, or he's not the first man to put you in handcuffs, and this and that and the third, and I was like, okay, so there's obviously some past abuse here. Yeah. But it was strange, because then I think we're having a little bit of inconsistency. Like, like, and I understand that you're trying to keep Gerald in character and he is outside of her, but like when he called her mouse, obviously because she's like it would make sense to me that because he is a representation of her own mind, an hallucination of her own mind, he now has knowledge that he didn't have prior. Right?
Yeah.
But then he called her mouse. So it's like, okay, so you know these things now because you're in her head. But then later he's like, well, what did he do? Why didn't you tell me these things? And I understand that that's supposed to be his character, like coming against her. Like, why didn't you tell me these things? Why didn't you open up?
Yeah.
But then it was just kind of weird and like inconsistent where he knew of the nickname Mouse, but then it wasn't establishing that he would also know those other things. I'm like, so then...
Yeah. I think to me, it was kind of, she's also digging into this memory piece by piece as we are the viewer, because it's a very buried thing that she has never really talked about.
Yeah.
And so I think the like verbal inquisition into it comes from she's not really remembering it full quite yet either. And Gerald certainly represents, you know, her father in this day and age. You know what I mean?
I mean, as I think about it, there's no way to have avoided that.
Yeah.
But it was just kind of, I don't know, it was just strange to me because we've talked about this before about how, like, you know, movies need to have clear and defined rules.
Yeah.
And it just felt like the rules of this hallucination started to get fuzzy because I think that, okay, you know to call her mouse. You know that she doesn't like that because of whatever, clearly past trauma. You're a hallucination from her own mind. You now have knowledge that she doesn't. But if in the moment where it was Jess and Gerald, right?
Yeah.
Where he was like, oh, what did he do to you? And then Jess and Jess were talking and it's like, well, would you have him give facts about the memory because he now knows these things? Or are you just going to have him purely inquiring in a way that expresses that he doesn't know these things? I don't know.
I suppose. I mean, I didn't necessarily find too many problems with the way those sequences carried out. But
that was just the one, I think.
Yeah.
For the most part, those sequences were actually really good.
Mm-hmm. I think another pitfall of the film is when sometimes it's like greater representations fall really flat. Outside of like the Gerald representing her father thing, that's fine. But then when you just have the whole Moonlight Man thing. So let's just talk about the end of the film here. So she sees this thing that she kind of associates with death, and at the very end, she confronts him because it's a real person. He just has like a weird deformed face, and he was there in the house. I cannot tell you how flat that ending fell on me when she went into the courtroom and did all that, because it was kind of like I already felt the gratification for the main character.
Right,
and I
yeah.
don't think that added anything. And I felt like the dialogue was really plain in that sequence of just like, oh, you're smaller than I remember or whatever. I'm just like, that's not cool. Because here's my thing. So there's, of course, mystery to darkness to not being able to see these things. I think it's visually plenty to now show this Moonlight Man in broad daylight in the courtroom, because he's not scary.
No.
He's not. And that's the point, is that, you know, in the light, he's not scary. But then to punctuate it in this cartoonish way is just kind of like a little cringy.
See, I was, when she walked into the courtroom, I was just expecting her to sit down and just like, okay, I'm here now. I'm confronting this. I'm watching it happen. I'm looking at this man. I'm just going to get the satisfaction and go on about my day. But she interrupts the court proceedings
with nothing with the judge to being like, hey, you can't do that.
Right, like everybody was just looking around like, what? And then she just clearly walks through the divider and nobody does anything. And then he turns around and speaks to her, even though it was established that he hasn't said a word to anybody. And so then he's like, oh, you're not real, you're Moonlight, whatever. And I was like, why are we having this?
Yeah.
And then he breaks the
just zip tie things.
He breaks his zip ties, and it's like, why? Like, I know it's a show of how powerful he is like a human being monster man, but it's just like, why are we having this? Because again, we already felt that satisfaction for the character.
And we already get that he's not near scary anymore.
Yes.
At least to me, I feel like visually they did a good job at like making him appear just kind of gross and weird.
Yeah, he made me like, I wasn't scared when I saw him previously in the movie, but I was uncomfortable. I was like,
but like then when you see him in the courtroom, you're just kind of like, oh, okay,
it's not scary. Yeah.
And I think that's all we needed. And her comic book strip dialogue is so out of place with the visual direction that it's just kind of like, So I don't know, like I said, it's so, I feel like technically well-rounded. It has pretty solid boundaries as a film. It just a little bit falls short on captivating, despite me having a lot of things I like about the film. And I think the editor, cinematographer, all those people did such a great job, because I mean, I feel like the editor did a good job at like pacing the film properly. One thing that I noticed, like the cinematographer did, or perhaps by director choice, whatever, when she's on the bed and looking over, like the camera is like completely POV.
Yeah.
Like it's angled in the exact way that her head is angled. And then when you go back to more of a reaction shot, it's like she's like in that angle. So it's like you're looking through her eyes for a brief moment. So their perspective is really nice. I don't know. I'm not going to lie. I kind of wish she would have died. Not like not in a twisted like edgelord way.
Yeah,
well, because she escapes and she gets in that car crash because she's delirious and losing blood.
Yeah.
And I thought she was gonna die because she handed her jewelry over to this representation of death, which in her mind was how that's what happens when you give over your jewelry.
Talk about opposite of captivation in that scene. When I was watching that, I was like, okay, like,
well, because then I thought that was more
like, it
of
made
her
sense, but it was just kind of like,
I would have liked that if that was more of her psychosis. Yes. And basically she gave over her jewelry and then crashed the car and died because she submitted to death.
Yeah.
And so to me, I thought that that's what was going to happen. And I felt like I would have liked that ending. I felt like even though it would have been so bitter, but it would have been in a way relieving because she did like give over her jewelry to this representation of death, which, it's a very drastically different ending and becomes a little too supernatural for what this film was going for. But
right. But then why even introduce, those paranormal elements in dialogue,
Yeah.
When you're, because Gerald was like, oh, you're safe from ghouls and whatever and ghosts, and I forget what monsters he said. But the issue is like, it made, when you find out he's a real person, it made a lot of aspects of the film not mean anything anymore. Mm-hmm. And you're just like, okay, so then why?
Yeah, I don't even know if this film, if you need to see it. This is gonna be a weird answer. Is this film good? I'm gonna say it's pretty good, but I don't like it.
I will agree. Which is very interesting. Goes back to the thing I said before of like, we will not like things, but very rarely will we call them bad.
Yeah, it's certainly not bad in the way just like it's full of plot holes, because it's not. It's pretty airtight. Mm-hmm. It just becomes really predictable because it kind of serves you foreshadowing on a silver platter. It's like if you were reading a book and they highlighted the foreshadowing. And so you're just kind of like, yeah, I saw that coming.
Thanks.
Yeah, just like,
hey, did you read that line?
Yeah, like, for real.
Yes, I read it.
It's like when you got to the end of the chapter, just quoted itself with the important dialogue.
It spark notes itself at the end of every chapter. Basically. Here's what you need to know going forward. Thank you.
One thing I do want to talk about, there are 2 changes from the book. This is pretty close to the source material from what I could find, because he did enjoy the book so much. But 2 things that I actually really like, these subtle changes.
Yeah.
One of them, in the book, from what I could gather, Jessie was into the game. Like, this wasn't her first participation at this point, and she was actually kind of into it, but it was during this particular experience when she was like, yo, no, I'm not comfortable with this.
Right.
And of course, the movie, this is her first experience doing this with Gerald. This is her first induction into Gerald's game. I like that. I think that's a really good change, because you understand her discomfort before you, of course, get into why these things make her uncomfortable with her past and everything. Her discomfort is, you can follow it because she's never done this before. She's awkward about it. Like, she doesn't know how to lay on the bed for this. She's very uncomfortable with the whole situation because she isn't used to this role play thing. So I like that change. The other one is completely a necessity to a degree. So in the book, again, from what I could tell, haven't read the book, but her hallucinations manifest mostly as voices, which of course doesn't work in a film.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The most major change, though, is in the book. These characters, there's many more characters, because her hallucinations.
I was reading that there were more characters.
Like one of the important ones is like her best friend or whatever.
Yeah.
So they reduced that down to just Jessie and Gerald, because
excellent choice.
I think it's a good choice as well. And the director basically was like, I wanted to focus on the marriage and give this a direction in that. And I think that's a good choice because A, it's pivotal to the story, and B, it's like, we don't have all day.
Yeah.
Like, we can't explore that much. And I think this representation was more than fine. And in fact, I think if it was anything different, it would have made the film, A, feel kind of convoluted, B, too long, and C, just, it would have a lack of direction. Whereas we're able to really focus on, some of the pitfalls of the marriage, as well as her past and how that plays into her marriage and why things went the way they did. So I think those are good changes.
I agree. I've just thought about this. When it comes to Stephen King book adaptions, I think you and me in a group, Stephen King's 0 for 2 right now.
Oh yeah,
he's 0 for 2.
Yeah, we're just gonna publicly say that we're not huge fans of it.
No, not at all. And people keep trying to get me to rewatch it, and I don't want to.
I've seen it twice. It didn't get better the second time.
Well, because that was the thing. Because I remember I went and saw Mother instead, based on recommendation by you. But like, my friend was like, we can go see Mother. And I said, I've already seen it. I am not watching that again.
Yeah.
And then it was really funny because at the end of Mother's, like, we could have been watching it. And I'm like, we wouldn't have been watching it.
Yeah.
And that person was like, why? I'm like, because I've already seen that movie and I don't like it. I'm not going to watch it again. Like,
for sure.
So, yeah, Stephen King, when it comes to mostly existentials, 0 for 2 when it comes to the books in the movie adaptions.
Maybe when it is more accessible and out, we'll do a a full
why,
review.
yeah, of like what is the issue.
For sure. So that, I think, wraps it up for our review of Gerald's game, concluding that it's pretty good. It's technically proficient. There's certainly a lot of things to appreciate from just a filmmaking standpoint, but overall it kind of falls flat, and it's I'd say I don't like it.
I would agree.
Yeah,
I don't particularly care for this film.
for sure. Oh,
We have something that we didn't like.
yeah, that's true.
Because I think I mentioned that to you off mic last week. I'm like, I don't think we've had anything that we haven't liked yet. We
Yeah,
just-
for sure. So there you
Or
go.
found something.
There
but-
you go. What are we checking out next week?
Okay, so it makes me laugh because you were like, "Oh, hey, I've been on a rap kick, and here I present to you more rap."
I figured.
We're gonna be checking out an album by Dame Dollar called "Confirmed." Dame Dollar is actually an NBA player who raps. It was just really funny because like, I am friends of a family that's like directly related to him.
Okay.
That doesn't really mean anything. Like, I haven't met the man, but I'm like it's weird to be in like some sort of weird proximity of people you see on TV in any sort of way. You're like, bless you.
Thank you.
You're just like, oh yeah, I know people who are related to that man. And even though that's not like I know that guy or as cool, you're just kind of like, that's strange.
Yeah, for
Like,
sure.
okay. So this is his second album. He had one a few years back, and the thing is a lot of people always kind of give NBA players flack for trying to rap.
Yeah.
But he actually does a pretty good job, and he actually kind of comes off as very sincere because he does rap about a lot of personal struggles he's had in life, and doesn't really, at least on his previous album, didn't really get too braggadocious.
Right.
And so that's something to be said because he comes off as a very genuine human being. And so I'm very interested in how this second album is going to come out, because his first album was well received, and you just, you make good products. So you're like, okay, cool.
For sure.
So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
It just came out. So we weren't close enough in date to check out the new Wu-Tang album because that comes out. And by close in date, I don't mean the viewer, but I mean us as people, because it comes out like the middle of this week. So you have like 3 days to jam pack that in, and there's no way to do that. So Dame Dollar Confirmed is what we're going to be listening to. It came out on October 6th. So,
Cool.
just kind of give it a shot. It's one of those things where I feel like we've done a lot of artists that like we've liked in the past and whatever. And I'm not saying that I dislike Dame Dollar, but he was kind of a little more middle of the road for me. And I was like, okay, so I want to kind of take an artist that I'm less familiar with and kind of throw them in the mix instead of like taking an album like, this was an album I'm looking forward to, let's review it. I'm like, okay, this is an album I wasn't really watching for it, I wasn't really checking for it, I'm vaguely familiar with the artist, let's put it on the docket.
For sure.
It was either that or Little Pump's album, Little Pump. And I was like, I'm
a pass on that.
yeah, I was like, I want to just throw in something that I know we'll both not like just cause, but then at the same time, I'm like, I don't want to listen to that.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, you can find that album we'll be checking out on the Spotify playlist that we have that contains all the albums that we review. Easiest way to check up on the albums we're listening to. Also, you can check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/mostly existential, or you can just, of course, search the Mostly Existential podcast on Facebook. We are also on multiple platforms. So if you aren't aware, we're on Google Play, Stitcher, even YouTube. So whatever you want to listen on, we are there.
we'll also be on multiple dating sites. So if you want to date the podcast,
yeah, if you want to date the podcast, we'll be on plenty of podcasts.
Plenty of podcasts. That's really good.
So we will come back to you next week with that album.
Using the same bass line as an outro.
I am doing a Kenneth Insect Spotlight. Right?
Kenneth Insect Spotlight. All
Yeah.
right.
Today, we are going to be talking about, homies, the thistledown velvet ant, which is not actually an ant, it's a wasp. But it's a wasp. The females of the species are wingless. The males retain wings, but they are covered in like these white bristles that look like velvet, except they're very coarse. So if predators want to eat them, it's a hard time to eat them. They make a horrible screeching noise when around predators. They also have like an odor thing that they do, and their sting is ferocious.
Where do these live so I can avoid that forever? No, why did you? No.
Yeah, they live in Arizona.
Can you
Utah,
next time,
Nevada?
Next time, choose an insect that doesn't live anywhere near me, so that way I can focus on my fascination rather than my morbid and unjustified fear.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't think about that. I'm like, yo, here we go. Here's this super rad bug, and it could be in your house right now. Like,
I don't think I've ever seen one.
I don't think maybe in this particular area, because I haven't seen them in this area, because we're also crazy like industrialized. So a lot of bugs and animal species have since moved on. But yeah, it was really cool. So that's the Kenneth Insect Spotlight. I want to do a jingle for that one of these days.
By all means. Podcast. Super generic.